There are cooking techniques so effective that governments, guilds, and trade monopolies tried to suppress them. Not because they were dangerous, because they worked too well, and the people who profited from selling food, fuel, and flavor had every reason to make sure ordinary households never figured them out. In China, where food culture runs deeper than almost anywhere else on Earth, the gap between what professional kitchens knew and what home cooks were permitted to know was sometimes enforced by law. Salt merchants held imperial monopolies. Tofu guilds protected their fermentation secrets. Fuel was taxed and controlled in densely populated regions, where cooking fires were a daily expense most families could not afford to waste. The techniques that survived were the ones ordinary people passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, in the margins of official food culture. They were practical, they were precise, and they worked under pressure. 6 of them still work today, in any kitchen, without any special equipment, and most of them will change how you cook permanently. The first one is called velveting, and it is the single most effective thing you can do to cheap, tough cuts of meat before cooking them. Professional Chinese restaurant kitchens have used it for centuries. And the reason your stir-fry at home never tastes quite like what you get at a restaurant is almost certainly because you are skipping this step. The method is straightforward. Slice your meat thin, against the grain. Combine 1 egg white, 1 tablespoon of cornstarch, 1 teaspoon of Shaoxing rice wine or dry sherry, and a pinch of salt per half pound of meat. Coat the meat thoroughly, then let it rest in the refrigerator for at least 30 minutes. When you cook it, the coating forms a physical barrier between the meat's proteins and the heat of the pan. Proteins that hit direct high heat contract and squeeze out moisture instantly. The starch coating slows that process down, trapping moisture inside while the outside develops texture. The result is meat that stays tender even in a screaming hot wok. In Cantonese restaurant kitchens, this technique was a trade secret passed exclusively within professional cooking lineages. Home cooks who figured it out independently were considered to have stumbled onto something they were not supposed to know. The second technique is what gets called the cold water shock, and it applies to every vegetable you have ever boiled or blanched and found disappointing afterward. Bring a pot of heavily salted water to a full rolling boil. Drop in your vegetables for no more than 60 to 90 seconds. Green beans, broccoli, bok choy, snow peas, asparagus. Then immediately transfer them into ice water and leave them there for the same amount of time they spent in the pot. What you are doing is arresting the enzyme activity that continues breaking down chlorophyll even after heat is removed. The brief boil in salted water softens the vegetable cell walls just enough. The ice bath stops the process at exactly the right moment and locks the color in at its peak. The result is vegetables that are vivid, firm, and genuinely flavorful, instead of olive drab and limp. In traditional Shanghainese household cooking, this technique was considered basic competence, not a professional skill. The reason it disappeared from Western home cooking is that it requires 2 pots and some intention, and convenience culture made the second pot feel like an unreasonable ask. The third technique is Maillard Control through dry surface cooking, and it is the explanation for why your pan-fried foods often steam instead of sear. The Maillard reaction, the chemical process that produces browning, crust, and the flavor compounds that make cooked food taste like cooked food, requires a dry surface and a hot pan. Moisture on the surface of your protein or vegetable creates steam before the surface can brown, and steam keeps the temperature at the pan surface just below the threshold where Maillard chemistry begins. In traditional Sichuan dry wok cooking, which developed in kitchens where fuel cost was a constant pressure, ingredients were pressed between dry cloths or left uncovered in moving air for 10 to 15 minutes before they went into the pan. The pan itself was heated until a drop of water evaporated in under 2 seconds. Then the ingredient was placed flat and left completely undisturbed for 90 seconds before being moved. The result was a crust that formed properly before moisture had a chance to escape and ruin it. Sichuan dry wok technique was considered craft knowledge, and families who had it cooked at a level that neighborhoods noticed. The investment was zero. The difference was knowing what surface moisture does to heat. The fourth technique is using baking soda to tenderize meat, which sounds like a food chemistry shortcut, but is in fact one of the oldest pH manipulation methods in Chinese cooking, used long before the compound had a Western name or a commercial application. The mechanism is well established. Alkaline environments denature the surface proteins of meat in a way that prevents them from tightening and toughening under heat. The method is simple. Dissolve a quarter teaspoon of baking soda in 2 tablespoons of water per pound of meat. Coat the meat, let it rest for 15 to 20 minutes, no longer, or the texture becomes unpleasantly mushy. Then rinse it thoroughly before cooking. In Cantonese dim sum kitchens, this technique was used specifically on pork and beef, destined for steamed dishes and braised preparations where tenderness was the primary measure of quality. The kitchens that knew this technique could produce dishes from cheaper secondary cuts that competed directly with dishes made from expensive primary cuts. That economic advantage was real, and it was protected. The fifth technique is something that many home cooks have heard of, but almost none have implemented correctly, and that is layering aromatics by heat tolerance rather than adding them all at once. Garlic, ginger, scallions, dried chili, Sichuan peppercorn, fermented black bean, and fresh herbs are all aromatics, but they have radically different flash points and flavor release windows. Dried spices and fermented ingredients release their compounds slowly and need sustained heat. Fresh aromatics like garlic and ginger release their volatile compounds quickly and burn fast. Scallion greens are pure garnish. They contribute fragrance, not cooked flavor. In classical Chinese kitchen technique, codified in professional training lineages that stretch back through the Tang and Song dynasties, aromatics were always added in sequence, based on their heat tolerance, not thrown in together. Hard-dried spices went into cool oil at the start of heating. Garlic and ginger followed when the oil was hot but before it smoked. Scallion whites went in shortly before the main ingredient. Scallion greens went on at the end off heat. Every layer was given the exact amount of time it needed. The flavor output of this approach is not incrementally better than throwing everything in together. It is categorically different. The reason most home cooks do not do this is that no one teaches it as a system. It looks like a collection of small decisions. It is actually one coherent principle applied at every stage of the same dish. This is also the point where a larger pattern becomes visible. Velveting, cold water shock, dry surface preparation, pH manipulation, sequential aromatic layering. Every one of these techniques is doing the same underlying thing. They are managing a physical or chemical process at the moment when that process is most sensitive to intervention. The Chinese cooking tradition, across its many regional schools, developed an unusually precise intuition for identifying the exact moment when something is about to change. The second before proteins contract, the moment before chlorophyll degrades, the window before surface moisture becomes steam, and acting in that window rather than trying to correct afterward. This is not intuition in the vague sense. It is a specific learnable skill, and the reason it was worth protecting as professional knowledge is that it cannot be replicated by better equipment. It requires understanding what is actually happening in the pan. The sixth technique is the one that belongs at the end of any list like this, because it is the most counterintuitive and the most impactful, and it has been hiding in plain sight in Chinese cooking for well over 1,000 years, while Western kitchens have spent decades and significant money trying to achieve the same result through machinery and chemistry. It is called Zui Cai in one of its oldest forms, which translates roughly as drunken vegetables, but the underlying technique is controlled enzymatic fermentation, using low alcohol content as a preservation medium combined with targeted salt concentration to achieve texture transformation without heat. Here is what that means practically. You take a vegetable, cabbage, radish, cucumber, or green beans work best, and you cut it uniformly, which matters because uniform surface area means uniform fermentation rate. You dissolve salt at a concentration of 2% by weight relative to the vegetable weight. This is not a rough estimate, it is the specific number. And you let the vegetable sit in that brine for between 6 and 12 hours at room temperature. Then you add a small amount of rice wine or Shaoxing wine, no more than 2 tablespoons per pound of vegetable, and you seal the vessel. Over the next 24 to 72 hours, the salt draws moisture from the vegetable cells through osmosis, creating a natural liquid environment in which lactobacillus bacteria, already present on the vegetable surface, begin converting natural sugars to lactic acid. The low alcohol environment suppresses pathogenic bacteria while allowing lactobacillus to thrive. The result is a vegetable that is preserved without refrigeration, transformed in texture from raw to pleasantly firm and deeply flavorful, and enriched with live bacterial cultures that are now confirmed by modern food science to support gut microbiome health. In rural Hunan province, this technique was applied to whatever vegetables were available before harvest, extending the effective food supply of a household across seasons when nothing was growing. The salt concentration was not guessed, it was known. It had been calibrated through generations of observation, passed within families as a precise measurement at a time when precision was not a concept most people associated with home cooking. The modern equivalent of what this technique produces costs $4 to $6 per small jar in specialty grocery stores and is marketed as a probiotic functional food. The actual input cost is vegetable scraps, salt, and time. What these 6 techniques share is something worth naming directly. None of them require better ingredients. None of them require newer equipment. All of them require a specific action at a specific moment in a specific sequence. And the reason most home cooks have never used them is not that they are difficult. It is that they were not part of the knowledge that passed from professional kitchens into general cooking culture. They stayed inside the lineages that had reason to keep them. They survived because they worked reliably under real constraint. In kitchens where fuel was expensive, where ingredients could not be wasted, where the difference between a dish that worked and a dish that did not was not a matter of preference, but of whether a family ate well or ate poorly. That context did not produce romance, it produced precision, and precision does not expire. The thing you can do today, in the next 10 minutes, with no purchase and no special equipment, is to take whatever protein you were planning to cook this week and apply the velveting technique. 1 egg white, 1 tablespoon of cornstarch, a small amount of wine or water, and 30 minutes in the refrigerator before it goes into the pan. That is the entry point. Once you feel the difference in what comes out of the pan, the other 5 techniques will make immediate sense, because they are all expressions of the same logic, that the most important moment in cooking is almost always the moment just before you think the cooking has started. The knowledge that constraint produces is not a substitute for abundance. It is better than abundance. It is the understanding of what is actually happening, so that you can work with it instead of around it.